welcome to our post-election recovery webinar on the science of global coherence. It is such a thrill for me to be able to share this time and welcome Rollin McCraty into this conversation. In fact, Rollin's going to kick us off with a presentation on the science of global coherence. I was introduced to Rollin some months ago when my book Resonate was cooking, and I was working with a lot of different people. They said, you're interested in resonance. There's some people you need to meet. And Rollin's name kept coming up. Of course it would, because Rollin has been in this field even longer than I have. He started working with HeartMath in 1991 and is I love this, a psychophysiologist. If those of you who know me know I'm a biophysicist by training. So we're both coming in this Venn diagram of putting mind and body together and have made it our life passion in the different areas in which we've worked. And of course, my own passion for getting mind and body to add up and working with the resonance of the human instrument. And that's going to be one of the themes that Rollin takes us into from really his own vast body of research through the HeartMath Institute. Rollin has been the director of research. He's an executive vice president at HeartMath and has been so interested in how emotion conditions what we feed the field, what we put out there as leaders, as family members, as people facing a dicey election week. What we put into the field, as we'll see from Rollin, matters. And how can we create some of the larger scale effects we would want for the people we love, the communities we love, the countries we love? That has taken Rollin in the directions of a Global Coherence Project that he will also talk with us some about, and we'll share some things on that, how we can have an action at a distance. And we'll be talking about some of the science behind that and some of the potential for your own participation in that. So, Rollin, without further ado, why don't we make Rollin the host so he's able to share his screen. And let me invite you, I love the gallery view and seeing everyone, but let me invite you to click speaker view so that you're able to see more clearly what Rollin has to share with us. And we're over to you, Rollin.
All right, great. Give me just a second here. I've learned there is a way that you can actually see everybody and the PowerPoint, by the way, in Zoom. I've been a Zoom user for a long time. I just learned that little trick somewhat recently. But I'm not going to take the time to do all that now. So anyway, thank you, Ginny, for the invitation to speak with your tribe or whatever you call yourselves, your community. And so I'm going to keep this kind of short. We wanted to do a little bit shorter presentation and have more time just to kind of ramble and talk a little bit, I guess, if I remember right, Jenny. So anyways, this global coherence. Let me just get into this. So what is coherence anyway? I think most people have an intuitive understanding of the term. If you look it up in the dictionary, it's almost, first definition is almost always about the quality of someone's speech. So hopefully I'm able to string my words together here today in a way that convey a coherent meaning. Right? If I'd had a little bit too much to drink and uttering nonsense, you'd call me what? Incoherent, right? So that's the common people-friendly or definition. The term is also, of course, used widely in physics across pretty much any discipline you want to take a look at, and it's in almost always in the context of a complex system or a system of some kind, where you've got a lot of parts that have to work together for some greater function to emerge than the sum of the parts. That's actually embedded in the term. So there has to be some type of communication and connection between all those parts. So it always implies connectedness. And if we're talking about a coherent system, that those subparts are all working together harmoniously and energy efficiently, and there's stability across time of that system. And as I kind of already indicated, it always suggests that there's some output or some greater function than the sum of the parts in a coherent system. And of course, living systems were pretty obviously coherent across many scales of magnitude. And and across time. It's kind of amazing what all has to happen if you think about it, from the from the subatomic to the molecular to the organs to the all the functions that a living system has to be coherent across. A lot of you are probably familiar with Ilya Prigogine, who basically demonstrated that when in an open system that's far out of equilibrium, small islands of coherence in a sea of chaos has the capacity to lift the whole system into a higher order. So that's what we're really talking about in a way. It's a great kind of statement in terms of our own physiology, our own function. So that's what we call personal coherence, and I've spent, I don't know, probably the last 25 of the 30 years of my research path on personal coherence and tools and techniques that allow us to shift in to a more optimal state. We're doing a lot of work these days on the social coherence side of things, which is how harmoniously, at a simple level, are the people getting together, whether that's a family, a work team, a community, and new programs and interventions and certification trainings to help create that at many different levels in society. And then, of course, global coherence, which is the primary focus of today. Just quickly, personal coherence, I look at it as an optimal state. And there, by the way, there's well over 400 independent studies now that have looked at training individuals how to get more coherent, is in our definition, and the benefits that has. And it's everything from improved health outcomes to better academic performance to better sports performance. I mean, it's a pretty wide gamut, and studies that have been conducted really globally. But anyway, it's an optimal state in which the mind and emotions are brought into alignment and in sync with the energetic heart's intuitive guidance. Now, that would take a whole probably hour to unpack just that statement and all the science behind it. But as we know, as people practice getting their physiology into a more coherent state, it creates this wide cascade of events that happen in our nervous system, in our biochemistry, but especially in our mental emotional stability. So that's just, several hours there compacted into one or two statements. I hope that conveyed some type of coherent meaning. So as Ginny said, I'm kind of known these days for asking the question, or asking you to ask the question, what am I feeding the field? And so why don't we can talk a little bit about that on the social and then mostly on the global level. If we put electrodes on the body and, across the chest and measure the thing that doctors do all over the world, probably hundreds of thousands of times, at least every day, the electrocardiogram, or we put electrodes on the head and measure brain waves. With those electrodes, what you're literally measuring is the flow of electrical current. That's why it's called the electrocardiogram. And the heart, of course, produces by far the largest source of rhythmic electrical energy in the body. But whenever there's a flow of current, as we measure with our electrodes, you also are producing a magnetic field. This is kind of physics, 101. Anytime there's a current flow, you create a magnetic field. And magnetic fields and electric fields are quite different, although we call it electromagnetism. They're very different properties and functions of those fields and the way they behave. And one of the qualities of magnetic fields is they go through things. By the way, in my past life, I don't mean past life, but this life, I was a communication engineer. I used to work for Motorola. So something I know a little bit about. So basically, we're very good at using electromagnetic fields to carry information. It's how your cell phones work, right? Or TVs, radios, all that. We're using those fields to carry the information. Now, we all know that our cell phones work inside of buildings, right? Or even inside of an elevator, a closed metal box. Well, it's the magnetic field that's going through the things, through the walls, and so on. So in human tissues, it's the same thing. So the magnetic field easily radiates external to the body and can be easily measured with devices called magnetometers. So the electrodes don't see the magnetic field, you have to use a magnetometer. So we can measure the heart's magnetic field many feet away from the body. You can measure a brain wave using the same instrument about an inch away from the head, just to kind of give you the relevance of the strength of these fields. Now, the vibrational patterns of the field, the heart's field, changes based on our emotions, our attitudes, our intention. and can actually and have measurable effects on those around us. And I think I have a slide in here to show you an example of that. So you can think of this as your personal field environment. Right? And by the way, we can tell somebody's emotional state with about 75% accuracy, whatever face they're putting on. You know, the energetics don't lie, what they're really feeling, by just looking at these patterns in the field environment. In fact, it's using very similar techniques that I would have used back in my Motorola days as a communication engineer to demodulate or decode the information being carried by a radio transmitter, for example, that we're using here. I won't go into the details, but basically the point here is you can see these different spectral patterns or vibrational information are very different depending upon whether the person's feeling appreciation or anger. And it's pretty fascinating. These all change very rapidly in real time in response to our emotional states and so on. So for sure, the field's carrying information about our emotional state, probably a lot of other things we don't know yet or haven't been able to prove. More recent work, I'll just kind of show you this one slide here. This is looking at what you can think of as heart-to-heart synchronization. Well, it actually is that. And this was a study. We had about 20 people all simultaneously wired up. And I won't go through all the details here and doing different exercises and shifting into a coherent state. In this case, we had them paired, not paired physically, but so it'd be like, okay, I'm going to get into a heart coherent state with a technique called the heart lock-in, and I'm going to focus on sending my appreciation to Ginny. And Ginny's going to send it to me. So paired up that way, you know, a room full of 20 people as this phase of the experiment, and then looked at the synchronization between those pairs. And that's what you're seeing a sample of here. So on the left are the actual HRV patterns, and then on the right are the spectrums of that. And then we can see at an amazing degree of frequency coherence there. And I wouldn't have believed this if I hadn't done it ourselves and seen this ourselves, that this level of synchronization could occur, you know, in a room full of people like this. And what's even blowing me away more is I have a colleague in the UK who's doing similar experiments and finding this also works non-locally. And what we both found is that one of the main drivers or predictors is probably a better word of this capacity to synchronize like this is the emotional connection between the individuals. You know, so if we have that, I'll work with you, but I don't like you, you know, that kind of separation, you don't tend to see synchronization. So it's very much involved with a positive emotional bond, as well as being coherent, as well as one of the factors.
And Rollin, if I could just jump in here on this last slide that you're showing.
Sure.
You mentioned HRV. You're talking about heart rate variability there is what you're measuring?
Yes, sorry about that. I'm just bypassing so many things.
No, I understand. But a question has come up. A couple of questions are arising in the chat around, and I know this is so close to your work. Are there practices we can do to get into this heart rate coherence?
Yeah, that's what HeartMath's all about. Once you understand the physiology, there are a number, probably about 8, I would say, core techniques, but lots of other spin-offs of those that allow a person to shift into this more coherent state, really anytime, anywhere. So out of our 8 techniques, only one is what you would call a heart meditation type technique. All of the others are really focused on in the moment self-regulation. In other words, I like traffic analogies because they're pretty ubiquitous for people, but you know, there we are, you know, all the traffic lights are green, you know, we're in the flow. As my wife likes to say, the parking angel's out, and you pull up and there's the perfect parking spot in front of the place you're going and all of that. It's pretty easy to be kind of in the flow and self-regulated, you know, but what happens when you hit the traffic jam and you're late, right? Or the parking angel's nowhere to be found, these kinds of things. Those are when we tend to get more frustrated or impatient and so on, right? I mean, who doesn't? It's legal. It's being part of being human, supposedly. Well, that's the moment that we want to self-regulate and actually create flow in what we would call non-flowing situations and really maintain our composure and coherence. I mean, after all, getting frustrated and impatient is not going to make the traffic move any faster, right? All it does is create emotions that deplete our system. Anyway, I'm going kind of off on a tangent here, but so anyway, we can shift into coherence with practice anytime, anywhere. And by the way, coherence, a lot of people will confuse coherence with relaxation. They are very different physiological states. And you can, with some practice, you can be in a coherent state at almost any heart rate. Right. So that's why we do so much work in law enforcement and first responders, things like that, because sometimes you really need a higher heart rate. You got to take care of business, but you want to be in this optimal coherent state, where we're able to be emotionally composed and have our mental acuity, kind of online and facilitated. So anyway, I probably should have included more of those slides. Good question. Hopefully that answered your question, Jenny.
Yeah, and I noticed a number of you are starting to write some questions in the chat. I think what we'll do is let Rollin share with us what he wanted to offer, and then we'll come back on some of these questions. We'll have at least half the session to talk about some of these things more deeply.
Yeah, I think that's probably a better approach, because I might even answer some of them.
That's right. So back to you.
All right, so I'm going to kind of jump down into the Global Coherence Initiative, GCI for short. So these are just some kind of high-level considerations I would ask. So the first one is a kind of a no-brainer. The Earth is constantly bathed in electromagnetic fields. We live within the geomagnetic field, for example, and then even the Earth's magnetic field is contained within the sun's magnetic field. So we really do live in a nested hierarchy of fields within fields. And what I'm suggesting is that these fields, these global level fields, literally connect and affect every living organism on the planet. Obviously, us as part of that, but animals, trees, all living systems. So we're all living in this common vibrational field, and we're all, as I was saying earlier, we're all contributing to that field. What are we feeding the field? We're either feeding it our positive or negative vibrations, that based on what our moment-to-moment thoughts and attitudes are. And if that's true, what I'm suggesting here anyway, and that's nothing new here, this idea that large numbers of people coming together, but what I am saying is different here, that when we're in a heart-centered state, a coherent state, and really feeding the field love and compassion from a coherent perspective, that does put a stronger coherent signal into the field environment, and that has the capacity to help others wake up, if you will, just to put it simply, and offset the fear and the stress and literal hate that's going on in the field right now. As I came in talking about the election, think of what's being fed, how much anxiety. I'm hearing it, people talk about kind of almost a national anxiety going on right now that we're still in around this. And that's in the field. I actually perceived it the other night myself, actually on election night. I could actually feel it. It was palatable for me. So a little history here gives credit to kind of the father of the field in a way, who was a Russian astrophysicist, Alexander Chesovsky, who was basically drafted into World War I, and being a scientist and an astrophysicist was kind of keeping one eye on what the sun was doing, and that was his thing. But it occurred to him, or it appeared to him, I should say, that during high solar activity, solar flares and resulting magnetic field disturbances and so on, that people down here on Earth just kind of got stupid, and we're doing, things they wouldn't normally do. So that got him intrigued. So after the war was over, he did an exhaustive study of human history. And I'm going to show you his original data that he published, and was actually nominated for a Nobel Prize, but that's a whole other story of why he couldn't get out of Russia to do that. The blue line that you see on this graph, if we start on the top on the very left-hand side, and then it wraps around on the bottom graph. So it starts in 1749 on the top and ends in 1926, actually. What's being plotted in that blue line, there's basically a dot every year for that time span for the number of major human events that occurred on Earth that year, each year. So big events, revolutions, starts of wars, major discoveries, things that had global impact, basically. The red line on the bottom is the solar cycle for the same time period. So you think there might be some type of a relationship there. Pretty amazing, actually. And by the way, I first learned, it's amazing that we don't know, but most of us don't know about this fundamental work. In fact, I learned from another one of my mentors, Franz Hallberg, who coined the term circadian rhythm, for those of you who don't know. Franz's work, he passed away just a few years ago, actually. Anyway, this has been extended into modern times and reanalyzed many, many times over by many groups, and it's a very real and strong finding. In fact, in modern times, the peaks of these solar cycles was when we had 9/11, Arab Spring, boom, all just boom, 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 line up right on these peaks, just like this. I'm only going to, I could talk more about this, but so during these peaks, and the solar cycle is about a 10.5 to 11-year cycle, is what the frequency was that we were seeing there. So during those peaks of solar activity, in fact, Chesowski was a pretty insightful guy, because he was also looking at physiological measures of people. And remember, this is the 1920s, and things at that time that are common now that weren't known then are things like X-rays, UV radiations, a bunch of things that we now commonly know that the sun radiates that weren't known then. He actually predicted that these unknown forces had to be present based on what he was seeing in human physiology from the sun. But it's during those peaks that more wars start, like 80%. Of all wars start around the peaks of solar periods. So that could sound like it's out to get us, but here's really important. This particular research that was done later by a different group globally across independent cultures all around the world, is that those same time periods are also the greatest times of human flourishing. More collaborations, cooperation, discoveries, flourishing in the arts, sciences, all happen in those same time periods. So the way I would invite you to think of this is during those increased solar cycles, the sun literally puts out more energy. We can measure these things now. We couldn't back in Chesowski's time. And that is basically absorbed by, I think that's probably the wrong word, but the magnetic field of the Earth, and then down into the physiology of living systems. So we have these energy inputs, and it really gets down to how mature we are, how self-regulated we are, how we use that energy. This is all unconscious. People have no idea what's going on, right? They just have more energy. Right, kind of a fun thing for me anyway. I was given a version of this presentation in Saudi Arabia a number of years ago. And I got to this point, and a guy stands up in the audience, raises his hand. Dr. McCraty, can't we come up with a system where we just lock up all the politicians during these solar cycle, these peaks? Right, which is not a bad idea. Anyway, so you get my drift hopefully there, that this is, so if we're going to do science, we have to measure things. So as it turns out, there really wasn't a system for measuring the resonant frequencies in the Earth's magnetic and energetic systems. I wish there had been. We had to kind of create it ourselves. So this is called the Global Coherence Monitoring System. So we currently have sites in, here at our location in California, where I am, Lithuania, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, New Zealand. Would have had one in Colombia already if it wasn't for COVID. Canada, some of the sites. And these are not trivial to do. These are, it's about $75,000 to install a site. These are ultra-sensitive magnetometers designed specifically to measure the resonant frequencies in the Earth's magnetic fields, which I'll explain what I mean by that. Normally, if I had more time, I'd show you pictures of other sites and some of the stories around them. So what are we talking about here anyway? So in this picture, we're seeing kind of an idealized image of what the geomagnetic field looks like. Right, so geomagnetic field is a pure magnetic field. It's static and stationary. The magnitude is not really varying much day to day. Over hundreds of years, yes, but that's not something we need to be concerned about. So what our compasses tune into, right? The North and South Pole. We all know what the geomagnetic field is. What isn't so much understood, in fact, I only a few years ago learned about it when I had to get into the kind of move from my psychophysiology background into Earth scale geomagnetics, is, well, so let's time travel back to science class. Remember back when you were in school in science class and you got iron filings and you got to dump them on a glass plate and you put a magnet under it, right? Remember I got to do that? Remember that, right? Or you've seen demonstrations of it anyway. So then the iron filings, they all kind of jump around and line up and showing you the shape of the magnetic field of whatever your magnet is, right? whether it's a bar magnet or a ball or whatever, a different shape. But the point is, what I want you to recall is those metal filings, they're in lines. They weren't just black homogeneous blob. They're in very specific field lines, right? So that's a good way of visualizing what are actually called magnetic field lines or flux lines in some circles. They're very real things. Okay, and that's what our white lines are representing here. Now, here's the thing that was kind of like an aha for me about 10, 15 years ago, is magnetic field lines can act just like strings on a guitar or any instrument, and you can pluck them and they vibrate. All right, and the technical term for this is called field line resonances. Science finally made something simple to say what it actually is. So these magnetic field lines can vibrate, and what's plucking the strings of Earth's magnetic field is the solar wind rushing by, which is traveling about 1 million miles per hour on a quiet day. Meanwhile, Earth is turning, and so is the sun, and so you've got these complex interactions, and the field lines are being plucked and vibrating away. Now, this is pretty cool. This is fairly new data. So NASA sent up 5 low orbit satellites specifically to study the magnetic field of the Earth. And the little white dot in the center of this slide, that's Earth. So what you're seeing here is this is real data. This is not some artist making a picture. This is actual data from this network of satellites showing us the real shape and complexity of the Earth's magnetic fields. You can actually see the vibration, the resonating, if you will, vibrating field lines here. Pretty cool, huh? To actually be able to see it and visualize it. Now, when we measure these frequencies here on Earth with our global network of magnetometers, and by the way, there's lots of magnetometers that measure Earth's field out there. They're just not, they're more designed to protect satellites and power grids. So they don't measure the resonant frequency. They're measuring the ripple or the noise, the disturbance on the field. So it's a very different approach. So one of the primary resonant frequencies of these field line resonances that we measure here on Earth is at a frequency of what's called 0.1 hertz. So it's a subhertz, about a 10-second rhythm. But all the peaks you see here overlap with human physiology, with the rhythms in our heart, our nervous system, basic autonomic nervous system rhythms, and so on. So 0.1 hertz is again one of the primary resonant frequencies of Earth, is exactly the same frequency as the human coherent heart rhythm that we've been talking about. Okay. All right, so then there's another set of magnetic waves that's worth talking about here, relevant. And these are called Schumann resonances. A lot of people have heard of them, and there's a lot of misinformation out there in social media about Schumann resonances. Don't believe any of it. It's nonsense. Most of it's nonsense. But Schumann resonances, this is a completely different mechanism than the field lines vibrating like I was just talking about. These are magnetic waves that are traveling around the surface of the Earth, that are trapped between the Earth, the top of the surface of the Earth and the bottom of the ionosphere. And the ionosphere, if you're not familiar with it, just think of it as a big soap bubble around the planet of a layer of highly ionized, it's actually a plasma, what it's called, the fourth state of matter in physics, the sheath around the Earth. Also, both the magnetic field and the ionosphere are really quite important for life on Earth as we know it. We really need them. So one of the properties of this plasma sheath covering the Earth, it starts about 50 miles up, the ionosphere does, is that it's like a mirror to magnetic waves. They bounce off of it. In fact, this is why how ham operators, used to, they send their radio signal up, it hits the ionosphere, it bounces off, and that's how you're talking to somebody in the U.S. is talking to people in England or China, things like that. You get a second bounce, and then you're talking to South Africa, and, New Zealand, and things like that. Anyway, so these magnetic waves the frequency of them is completely determined by the geometry of this cavity. And they're called Schumann resonances because a guy named Otto Schumann was a German mathematician who predicted their existence. So they got named after him. There's actually 8 of them. Most people only talk about the first one or even know that they exist. So the first one is 7.83 hertz as its kind of baseline frequency. And that was immediately recognized as overlapping with human brain waves. The low alpha rhythm is actually that kind of that transition right between theta and alpha. Because it turns out all 8 of these Schumann resonances have direct overlaps with human brainwave frequencies. Okay. So basically, what we now know is that the 2 primary rhythms or resonant frequencies of Earth overlap us, both our hearts and brains. And a lot of the stuff and by the way, the Schumann resonance is being controlled by the distance, the geometry. They are exactly the same as they were when they were first measured in 1960 today, as they were then. So if you see this stuff floating around, about the Schumann resonances are increasing and that reflects consciousness of the planet, that's all nonsense. Trust me, I have a global network to measure these things, and we monitor it 24/7 around the Earth. Anyway, so let me just slide back to that. So if we kind of think again back to science class, most of us either got to do it or saw demonstrations of tuning forks. We all know the resonant idea. You tap one tuning fork and the other tuning fork starts to vibrate, kind of magically if they're the same frequency. All right, that's demonstrating, that's actually resonant coupling. One of the things they didn't teach back in science class, at least for when I was there, is that tuning forks are highly coherent systems. You have to have coherence to have resonance. In a non-coherent system, there's no such thing as resonance. So with our tuning forks, you had air molecules that are mediating that energy and information exchange between the tuning forks. But it works exactly the same way with magnetics. So if you think about wherever you are now, how many of these invisible magnetic waves are right there around you now, between all the cell phone conversations that might be going on, in your area, or the TV transmitters, radio stations, on and on it goes. So how does our phone or radio know which of these magnetic waves to couple to? Well, we quite literally tune the receiver circuit to a resonant frequency. God, I'm old enough, so I see some of you probably are too here. Back when we had radios, you actually had to turn a dial, right? Remember those? And you had to kind of tune it in and get the station and drift, and you tune it in a little bit more. What you're literally doing there is tuning the receiver to be resonant, to have the same frequency of the magnetic wave of interest. As soon as we do that, voila, we couple to it and transfer the energy and information. And there's, the music playing on the radio station or the cell phone conversation we're having. Point is, when 2 systems oscillate at the same frequency or vibrate at the same frequency, we can easily transfer energy and information. The only thing with magnetic waves, you don't need the air molecules. Right? It works in space in the vacuum the same way. So I hope you get the point here, is that our hearts and brains are resonating at the same frequency of Earth. So we have the basic physics for understanding how we can transfer energy and information between us and the field. And in fact, a number of experiments have been done showing that our brains do synchronize with the resonant frequencies. And what I'm going to show you now is that our hearts are also synchronizing with the Earth. So this was a small study that I'm going to show you here that started a paradigm shift in at least our thinking, and I think many others in the field now. And this was a group of people that wore recorders. I actually happen to have one laying here that kind of looked like this little thing that you wear on across your chest that measures the electrocardiogram. They're gotten very small and lightweight nowadays, so you can wear them and you don't even know you've got them on after a few minutes. So a group of people wore these for 24 hours a day for a whole month, for 30 days. So we got continuous heart rate variability data. So the beat to beat change in each pair of heartbeats is what heart rate variability is, for 30 days. And some of the people in this study were literally located in Southern California, some in Central, where I am, California, and some in Northern California. This group, they didn't know, a lot of them didn't even know each other. They're going about their normal days and nights, for 30 days. And the purpose of that study, the original purpose, was to look at correlations between changes in our nervous system activity and the changing magnetic fields and solar fields and things. Lots of significant findings there. This is all published if you're interested in the gory details. The surprise came when we time synchronized all the recorders and the data and just averaged their heart rate variability data together. And what we expected was a noisy flat line. After all, why in the world should my beat-to-beat change in my heart rate have anything to do with somebody hundreds of miles away, right? That's not what we found. And what you're seeing here is actually that on the blue or purple line is the the time synchronized HRV of this group spread across the state, far from a noisy flat line. What this is showing is that they're actually synchronized. Their heart rhythms are synchronized. Now, the only thing that we could come up with to explain that would be that if all the people in the group were synchronizing to an external signal that they were all exposed to, one of our own hypotheses. So the red line is the strength or power of the resonant frequencies during that same time period. Again, you can actually see the correlations in the data. I mean, it's very strong. And on the right-hand side is the spectrum of the data and showing that they're exactly the same frequency. So this was indicating that a couple of things, I won't go into all that, but that we're far more in sync with the Earth than what we would have ever thought. And we did not expect to see this. In fact, we spent about 6 months trying to make it go away. Checking everything we possibly could. This is just, showed it to a few of my colleagues and their jaw drops and, that kind of thing. Anyway, it was a relatively small study, California, now it's California, it's got to be kind of wacky. Anyway, so we better see if we could expand and replicate this study. So we were able to get funding and did a large international or global study where we had large groups of 20 people in each group in 5 countries. So it's a lot of heartbeats, right? Did the same thing. So we had groups in New Zealand and Lithuania, California, Saudi Arabia, and also one in the UK area. This is not published yet. It's getting close to being published. But this is some of the results of that. Now, these are people pulled from these groups all around the world. And keep in mind, they're in radically different time zones in some cases, like 10, 12-hour differences in some cases. The black lines on both these graphs are the power of the resonant frequencies during that time period. The one on the left side is the Schumann resonance. We separate this into different spectral bands, right? And the blue line on the left is the HRV of these people from around the world, subsets of them. And on the right is the field line resonances. So the black line is the power of the field line resonance that I showed you earlier. And the blue line is the HRV. So again, what we're seeing here is I can confidently say now that this is a global phenomenon. Humanity is way more in sync with the Earth than what I would ever have thought. And actually our hearts are synchronized because of that synchronization as well. Hope that makes sense in brief. Now in this second study, we were able, what we actually did, something about in the middle of it, is we had all the groups, these 5 groups around the world, do a 15-minute what's called heart lock-in. This is kind of a heart-focused meditation, one meditation technique we do, for 15 minutes at the same time, right? And actually had a Skype call, I think is what we used back then for connecting all the groups at the same time, and kind of had one person lead everybody, all the 100 and some people through this technique for 15 minutes. Now, the data you're seeing here is we're looking at in this case, the Lithuanian group at the local level or the individual level. So there's 20 people in each group. So on the left side is the degree of synchronization that individual had over 24 hours with the Earth's magnetic field, the day before this heart lock-in exercise. The graph on the right is the day of the heart lock-in. So what you're seeing here is that just being in this heart coherent state for 15 minutes had a significant effect on increasing their synchronization with the magnetic field over the next 24 hours. Now, they also got more in sync with each other. We measured, there's a lot of stuff we measured. I don't have time to go into today here. But now I could show you the graphs from all the other groups, but I'm not going to because they all look just like this. Amazing. Again, this is stuff I would never have predicted that we would see. This, strong a result. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Are most of you familiar, or many of you, with the Global Consciousness Project? Just wave your hand if you are. I don't see a lot of hands here. Okay, this is a project that was started actually at Princeton 22 years ago by a close friend of mine, Dr. Roger Nelson. Wish I had more time to go into the details. There's a whole hour presentation just on this. If you're interested, you can check out on Awake TV network that Dr. Nelson and I did. But basically, you could think of this as a global, as a really neat scientific instrument that's distributed all around the world. That are these physical devices that are designed to make random numbers in a very strict and stringent way, and all send their data back to the central server. And what over the 20 years has been shown very clearly now, with the statistics are like p to the minus 47 trillions to one. I mean, it's a very robust effect when you look at a number of events over time. But when something happens that triggers a mass emotional outpouring of people, this global network responds globally in the same way at the same time. A coherence of sorts is added into these things that where it shouldn't be happening. Again, anyway, we know that it's emotion that drives this system, that causes these global changes. Nobody fully understands the mechanisms. We all believe it's a field effect from the data. There's 20 years of published data on this one, but my favorite project that Roger did, Dr. Nelson, was this one that I'm showing you here. So after a number of these events had been recorded, he wanted to look to see if the type of emotion had a different impact on this global network. So where it says high, these are events that were high in love and compassion. So these would be like global peace days. We just had one in September, right? The 21st year of those. But a lot of global meditations, where we're adding prayer or love or compassion to these large global meditations. Medium are events that have a lot of emotion, but not necessarily a lot of love and compassion. So like Super Bowl games, World Cups, a lot of emotion, right? But not really a lot of love and compassion. And the low category is the emotions that are triggered after like a terrorist attack or a school shooting, where the media had a large impact. And what he found was that those, as you see here, on high love and compassion had a significantly greater impact on moving or modulating this global network of devices. So you kind of think it's called the Global Consciousness Project because it's Dr. Nelson feels that we're actually measuring a global consciousness field. And I'm actually honored and privileged to say that he has asked us to take this over. So this is kind of coming under our purview now at the HeartMath Institute. So we'll be having our monitors, this monitor, and we're actually creating a new version of this. After 20-some years, we've learned a lot, and some new technologies have obviously emerged. So we're in the process right now of creating a version 2.0, GCP 2.0, that will be more sensitive. And by the way, it's a citizen scientist project. We will be through our research phase probably in the next few months. Then we want to get many more of these devices. So if you're interested in being a citizen scientist and hosting one of these devices, let us know. And we're basically going to sell them for our cost, which won't be very much money, and give you part of this global network.
Great. So Rollin, this is just wonderful. And I also want to say, maybe wrap up the slide part within the next few minutes so we can.
This is the last slide.
Oh, wonderful. All right.
So basically, just my message here is it's time to feed the field with more love and care.
What an important message. What an important.
What we feel the field, what I would just say is what we are feeding the field matters.
Yeah. What we are feeding the field matters. Magnificent. And, it's so interesting how so many of the effects you talked about are so far out of our conscious awareness. They're so far away from what we think matters. So maybe what we could do is let's stop the screen share and come back on to.
I'm doing right now.
There we go, and come back onto a gallery view. I've seen a couple requests for how do we put this in the body. I mean, I think it would be really wonderful, Rollin, if you would just, we have our ways through Zen training that we create a sense of a coherence through the head, the heart, and my interest in Hara, even the lower abdomen, a real power center for presence and leadership and martial arts. Maybe you could just guide us through a bit of how you would, even in this moment, invite us into some heart-brain coherence in this dicey week. What
Sure.
shall we do? Let's do something together to just enter that stage, and then out of that stage, we'll address other questions you may have.
All right. Happy to.
Thank you.
So let's all kind of get something somewhat comfortable. I'm gonna lead you through a technique called shift and lift, which is shifting into a coherent state and lifting the field environment. Is the idea behind this technique. And I'm going to invite you to close your eyes and we'll make it kind of a meditation. It's really meant to be an eyes open while you're in a conversation technique. So kind of maybe just keep that in mind. But basically, we're going to start with step one of this technique. It's called heart focused breathing. So you literally focus your attention in the center of your chest, the area of the heart. So focus your attention in the area of your heart and imagine your breath is flowing in and out of your chest or heart area. Breathing a little slower and deeper than usual, but find a rhythm that's comfortable. Usually have 4 or 5 seconds on the in breath, 4 or 5 seconds on the out breath, but don't hold your breath in between, just a rhythmic breathing. And that's the resonant frequency of the cardiovascular system, the coherent frequency. That helps shift our system into coherence. Now, as you do the heart-focused breathing, step 2 is activate feelings, heartfelt feelings of kindness, appreciation, genuine connection, and an attitude of deep listening. Maybe that's just deep listening to the voice of your own heart. Now let's take a couple of minutes and just radiate those heart qualities to raise your own vibration and help lift the energy field environment that surrounds you. So let's just radiate those heart qualities, appreciation to each other. That's all here in this group together. Okay, so you're enough to get us into at least a little bit of coherence here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Wow. You know, I'm reflecting on some of the questions that we posed ahead of time about action at a distance, and yet it's so clear that there's so much happening at a distance affecting the local, right? That it's not so much a question of how do you have action at a distance, it's more like how to plug into the distance that's already happening. What would you say about that, Rollin? How is it that our coherence can help even our communities through a dicey week?
Well, I mean, at our own personal level, just maintaining our own coherence is emotional stability. So we don't get caught up in the dramas and, because like I know that the election's the big thing right now, but the way I look at it, the election's going to come out however it comes out. So whatever worry and all fear I might have, well, all that does is really throw my system into incoherence. We're going to have to deal with whatever your leanings are, however it comes out, we're going to have to deal with it. And half the country is going to be unhappy no matter what happens. So there's going to be a lot of incoherence in the field for a while. Right. So, however, if we're able to maintain our own coherence, what I'm really suggesting here is, and what I think the slide I showed you from Dr. Nelson's work, is the more coherent we are, and one of the best ways for us to be coherent is to be genuinely in a more appreciative, kind state that measurably increases our coherence, which increases our coupling or resonance with the larger field, both in our local and the global environments. So the more people that are feeding the field a coherent, aligned and coherent signal, and the more we do it together, there actually is a multiplicative effect. I can't talk today. that puts a stronger coherent signal into the field environment. So,
You know, you even think of the root of the word compassion, compassion, one witness, one witness. And so it's more little wonder that one witness creates a greater sense of one witness, you know, but a great question has come up in the chat around what if we just feel depressed and down and difficult, to just kind of say put on a smiley face is sometimes not helpful. It is like we can't get there. How can we, what suggestions do you have, Rollin, for somebody who's in a dark emotional place
yeah,
where when they want to get into this coherent state, but there's some inside resistance?
yeah. Um, the I mean, that's depends on what we're talking about here. I mean, if somebody's in like clinical depression or something, that's a pretty tough one. But there actually are studies that show these techniques and this approach actually does significantly help in even clinical depression and a lot of these types of things. We have a lot more power to choose our own emotional diet than most people realize. And yeah, it takes some practice and it takes some effort, but we really can shift what we call our baseline. Now, I'd have to go into a whole neurophysiology discussion here the way I would like to, but basically, we really do have emotional and attitudinal baselines. And if we get enough time in, say, anxiety or depression or these types of things, that becomes our baseline. And the way the brain works is what is familiar to our baseline, you know, the current matching the baseline is what actually feels comfortable, even though if it's a maladapted baseline. I mean, I'll give you an example. I had one of my grandmothers when I was a kid, small child, worried about everything. I mean, she drove us crazy with her worry. But in her world, that was care, right? Worrying about us was caring about us. Now, that was her baseline, right? Now, of course, that's not healthy. I mean, you know, constant anxiety and worry, we know that the biochemistry and everything that's going on in our nervous system increases the aging process, you know, inhibits cortical function, all this stuff. So if it's really one of those deeper kind of baselines, there is no such thing as sustained change, like getting out of depression or, you know, the constant worries, fears, anxieties, without shifting our baseline. And that does, sometimes that, you know, requires a buddy, you know, to help us with that as a reminder. Because it does, we're overcoming some deeply ingrained literal neural patterns in the neural architecture. And another one of my, I might have mentioned, I probably didn't today here, but Carl Friedman was one of my mentors, pretty famous guy, considered by many the father of modern cognitive neuroscience. And he did some really, really cool work. Actually, he proves that the only way to establish a baseline and to shift one is to change the inputs to the brain from the body. This is revolutionary understanding that psychology needs to catch up to, actually, in my opinion. So by just being in a coherent state, and I know people aren't going to be able to just go appreciate something, right? Of course not, if you're in a maladapted one of those baselines. But just doing the breathing, the heart-focused breathing, you're starting to establish a coherent rhythm. And that's the signal going up to the brain. So even if it's just going to maybe not appreciation, right, but trying to self-direct an emotional shift. Maybe it's just neutral or ease, you know, a feeling of inner ease, or just neutral can be huge for a lot of people as a starting point. And then just practicing that until you can then maybe start in adding in things more like appreciation. And appreciation doesn't have to be this big gag thing. It could be the feeling that you have just thinking of remembering a place that you really like to go in nature and how you feel when you're there and recreate that feeling. Or for a lot of people, it's the feeling when they come home and their pet greets them, right? That feeling you have for your pet, just start recalling and kind of breathing that feeling. These are all kind of starting ways to start retraining our system into a new baseline. But you got to stay with it long enough for that to become established as our new inner reference.
That's right.
I know it's a long answer and probably more complicated than you're looking for, but.
No, it's it's great. I mean, from a Zen perspective, we often look at it in terms of attachments of the ego. You know, that these patterns in the nervous system are laying down a sense of I. You know, a sense of who I am, and you'd think I'd be really willing to get rid of my difficulties and darkness and all that, but no, as you say, it becomes a comfort zone. It becomes familiar, and
No,
and to get rid of it feels as much like a little death to the ego as you know, losing a loved one. I mean, it's stunning, and yet it happens. I mean, that's what patterning does.
I'll give you another example. It means that we're talking to a Zen crowd here. There was actually a study done in Zen monks in Japan, looking at their heart rate variability and the coherence of their heart rate variability. Oh God, this is probably 10 years ago now. I'm horrible with past time references, but at least 10 years ago, I think. And what they basically found, I won't go into all the gory details, is that if you had been a practicing Zen monk for 2 years or greater, they actually had resting, just looking at their resting state, coherent HRV baseline. Less than 2 years was the cutting point, not so much.
Not so much. Huh?
Well, no, but it's taking them time, right? I mean, that really showed though that that these Zen masters and monks said that heart coherence was their baseline, but it took time to get there. It doesn't have to take 2 years, is what I'm saying. With these kind of practices, these heart focused techniques, we can get new baselines in 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks on average, depending on, you know, a lot of variables there. But so it doesn't have to take that long. But so there's some, as we really understand this more, and you know, there's some shortcuts. Right. And by the way, that's when that becomes transformational. Is when we establish new baseline. Is that we're not having to put the same effort into it. It becomes our new automatic, kind of like our new operating system.
Exactly. A new way to use this resonant instrument, a new way that this thing functions. I'm seeing a question in the chat, Rollin, about how people who are interested in the Global Coherence Project can find you. What is the best way to reach you?
HeartMath.org.
HeartMath.org. Okay.
Is our website. And there is also a HeartMath.com, but that's the more commercial side. HeartMath.org is research and education. And
Wonderful.
so if you decide to want to get any of our devices or anything, hey, get them from the .org. It helps support our research. It's all, all of our research is funded by individuals. I mean, the kind of work we do, NIH is not going to care about, so we don't even bother. So it helps support us.
One of the questions that's come up is whether changes in the manipulation of the external field, how it's changing the internal state. When we have some of these, you know, mass emotional events, for example, how is that affecting individuals? Any research on that?
Sure. I mean, there's different levels of sensitivity to this, but how many of you, just ask the community here, have woken up in the morning and you just felt off, kind of edgy or out of sorts? And it's not because you had an argument with your spouse or something. You just wake up and then that way, and then you just happened to turn on the news and found out that there was some global event, you know, whether it was a hurricane or fires or a shooting. How many of you have had that experience where you actually noticed it and you linked them together, right? A lot of people don't link them together. They just wake up out of sorts. So it's a surprisingly high ratio when people pay attention that it's either something like that or that there's a geomagnetic storm going on. And people have different sensitivities to those two different types of energy in the field. Everybody is sensitive to geomagnetic storms, but to varying degrees, by the way. So that could be, is that, I mean, it's kind of a maybe a practical answer that works.
Yeah, it's really, that's helpful, because again, we tend to think about things in the human domain of concern, you know, like why do I feel off? What did I do wrong? Or what, you know, or what do I blame for this, you know? And yet the idea that we are responding to forces that are not good or bad, they are what they are, you know, and that we are, it's just a different dimension in which to see, or a different level at which to see we are connected.
Right, but let me add one thing there, Jenny, to that.
Yeah.
So you can think of it as whatever the chaos is around us, whether it's in the energetic environment, the magnetic, or the emotional energetic environment that's got triggered, like elections. or you can just think of it as practical for, I live in 160 acres in the redwoods here. I mean, it's a very quiet, lovely pace. So when I go to places like, New York City or even San Francisco, it ain't exactly my favorite place to be. It's not my familiar, it's chaotic and it's noisy and, and I want to get the heck out of there. But we can be in a chaotic environment, whatever that is. The whole point of what really HeartMath is about is that we can maintain our coherence no matter what the external is. Like I started with small items of coherence can create, coherence in larger systems.
And
it's about not being beat around by whether it's full moon or new moon or what the solar, is really being able to step into our own coherence, whatever the chaos in the external environment is. So, yes, they affect us, but they don't have to.
We say something very similar in Zen training, that it's expanding the range at which you can be centered, expanding the range at which you can be a useful presence and force in the world.
Yeah, or in the trauma work, it would be like our window of tolerance.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly right. Well, Rollin, obviously we could talk with you all day. This has been just fantastic, but I'm also conscious of people's time. We're at the top of the hour. So I will kind of bring things to a close with enormous gratitude to you for sharing, the science of global coherence, of social coherence, of personal coherence. And of course, putting this back into the body and back into our training, where we have ways to repattern the brain from the patterns we embody. And that's where it comes back to practice. So I thank you for offering us in a practice in this time. And I know many of you already have practices. They're already greatly and deeply a part of your life. In our Institute for Zen Leadership, we integrate these kind of practices into being a leader in the world, combining it with leadership skills. And to the point Rollin made earlier about sometimes you need a buddy, we also are rolling out ways you can work with a coach in this to help you between times. And Bob Karen has information about that. You see Bob. Bob, you can wave. If you want to reach out to Bob, you can learn more about the coaching. Thank you so much for giving some time for us to be together, and for your care and concern about what you feed the field. This is a week where it really matters, and I join you in let's feed it what we can. The story is going to be what it is, but how we meet the moment is what matters. So let's meet this moment with compassion and find the way that one witness can radiate to all the worlds we touch. So thank you.
Have a great day, rest of your day, everyone.